Welcome to Storytime. Tonight, we are going to be reading A Pair of Hands by Arthur Quiller-Couch. It is an old maid's ghost story. Yes, said Miss Lepayette, gazing into the deep fireplace, letting her hands and her knitting lie idle in her lap. Oh yes, I have seen a ghost. In fact, I've lived in a house with one for quite a long time. How you could, began one of my host's daughter. And you, Aunt Emily? Cried the other at the same moment. Miss Lepayette, a gentle soul, withdrew her eyes from the fireplace and protested with a gay little smile. Well, my dears, I am not quite the coward you take me for, and as it happens, mine was the most harmless ghost in the world. In fact, and here she looked into the fire again, I was quite sorry to lose her. It was a woman then? Now I think, said Miss Blanche, that female ghosts are the horridest of all. They wear little shoes with high red heels and go about tap, 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 wringing their hands. This one wrung her hands, certainly, and I don't know about the high red heels, for I never saw her feet. Perhaps she was like the Queen of Spain and hadn't any. As for the hands, it all depends on how you wring them. There's an elderly shopkeep in Knightsburg, for instance. Don't be so prosy, dear, when you know we're just dying to hear the story. Miss Lepayette turned to me again with a small deprecating smile. It's such a little one. The story or the ghost? Both. And this was Miss Lepayette's story. It happened when I lived down in Cornwall, at Tresslac on the south coast. Tresslac was the name of the house, which stood quite alone on the head of a coombe, within the sound of the sea, but without sight of it. For those in the coombe led down to a wide open beach. It wound and twisted half a dozen times on its way, and its overlapping sides closed the view from the house, which was advertised as secluded. I was very poor in those days. Your father and all of us were poor then, as I trust, my dears, you never will be. But I was young enough to be romantic and wise enough to like independence, and this word secluded took my fancy. The misfortune was that it had taken the fancy, or just suited the requirements of several previous tenants. You know, I dare say, the kind of person who rents a secluded house in the country, well, yes, there are several kinds, but they seem to agree in being odious. No one knows where they come from, though they soon remove all doubt about where they're going to, as the children say. Shady is the word, is it not? Well, the previous tenants of Tresslac, from the first to the last, a bewildering series, had been shady with a vengeance. I knew nothing of this when I first made application to the landlord, a solid yeoman inhabiting the farm at the foot of the coombe, on the cliff overlooking the beach. To him I presented myself fearlessly as a spinster of a decent family and a small but assured income, intending a rural life of combined seemliness and economy. He met my advances politely enough, but with an air of suspicion that offended me. I began by disliking him for it. Afterwards, I set it down as an unpleasant feature in the local character. I was doubtedly mistaken. Farmer Hosking was slow-witted, but as honest a man as ever stood against hard times, and a more open and hospitable race than the people on that coast I never wished to meet. It was the caution of a child who had burnt his fingers not once but many times. Had I known what I afterwards learned of Farmer Hosking's tribulations as a landlord of a secluded country residence, I should have approached him with the bashfulness proper to my suit, and faltered as I undertook to prove the bright exception in a long line of painful experiences. He had bought the Tresslac estate 20 years before, on mortgage, I fancy, because the land adjoined his own and would pay him for tillage. But the house was a nuisance, an incubus, and had been so from the beginning. Well, miss, he said, you're welcome to look over it, a pretty enough place inside and out. There's no trouble about keys, because I've put in a housekeeper, a widow woman, and she'll show you around. With your leave, I'll step into the coombe so far with you and put you in on your way. As I thanked him, he paused and rubbed his chin. There's one thing I must tell you, though. Whoever takes the house must take Miss Carkeek along with it. Miss Carkeek? Is that the housekeeper? I echoed dully. Yes, she was the wife to my late hind, sorry, miss," he added, my face telling him no doubt what sort of a woman I expected Miss Carkeek to be. But I had to make it a rule after some things happened. I dare say you won't find her so bad. Mary Carkeek's a sensible, comfortable woman and knows the place. She's in service of the Squire Kendall when he sold it and went. Her first place it was. I may as well see the house anyhow, I said dejectedly. So we started to walk up the coombe. The path which ran along the chattering stream was narrow for the most part, and Farmer Hosking, with an apology, strode on ahead to beat aside the brambles. But whenever its width allowed us to walk side by side, I caught him from time to time stealing a shy, inquisitive glance under his rough eyebrows. Curiosity bore through him. It was clear that he could not sum me up to his satisfaction, or bring me square with his notion of attendant for his secluded country residence. Don't know what foolish fancy prompted it, but about halfway up the coombe, I stopped short and asked, "There's no ghosts, I suppose?" It struck me a moment after I uttered it as a supremely silly question, but he took it quite seriously. "Nope, never heard tell of any ghosts." He laid a queer sort of stress on the word. "There's always been trouble with servants, and the maids' tongues will be running, but Mary Carkeek lives up there alone, and she seems comfortable enough." We walked on. By and by, he pointed out with his stick. "Don't look like a place for ghosts now, do it?" Certainly, it did not. Above an untrimmed orchard rose a terrace of turf scattered with thorn bushes, and above this terrace of stone, upon which stood the prettiest cottage I had ever seen. It was long and low and thatched. A deep veranda ran from end to end. Clematis, Bankska roses, and honeysuckle climbed the posts of this veranda, and big blooms of the mackerel were clustered along the roof beneath the lattices of the bedroom windows. The house was small enough to be called a cottage, and rare enough in features and situation to confer distinction on any tenant. It suggested that those days we should have called elegant living. I could have clapped my hands for joy. My spirits mounted still higher when Miss Carkeek opened the door to us. I had looked for a Miss Gummeridge and found a healthy middle-aged woman with a thoughtful but contented face and a smile which, without a trace of obliquiousness, bore the farmer's description of her. She was a comfortable woman, and while we walked through the rooms together, for Mr. Hosking waited outside, I took to Miss Carkeek. Her speech was direct and practical. The rooms, in spite of their faded furniture, were bright and exquisitely clean, and somehow their very atmosphere of the house gave me a sense of well-being, of feeling at home and cared for. Yes, of being loved. Don't laugh, my dears, for when I've done, you may not think that this fancy altogether foolish. I stepped out into the veranda, and Farmer Hosking pocketed the pruning knife which he had been using on a bush of jasmine. "This is better than anything I had dreamed of," I said. "Well, miss, that's not a wise way of beginning a bargaining, if you'll excuse me." He took no advantage, however, of my admission, and we struck a bargain as we returned down to the coombe of his farm, where the hired chaise waited to convey me back to the market town. I had meant to engage a maid of my own, but now it occurred to me that I might do very well with Mrs. Carkeek. This, too, was settled in the course of the next day or two, and within a week I had moved into my new home. I can hardly describe to you the happiness of my first month at the Tresslac, because, as I now believe, if I take the reasons which I had for being happy, one by one, there remains over something which I cannot account for. I was moderately young, entirely healthy. I felt myself independent, adventurous. The season was high summer, the weather glorious, the garden in all the pomp of June, yet sufficiently unkept to keep me busy, give me the sharp appetite for meals, and send me to bed in that drowsy stupor which comes from the odors of earth. I spent the most of my time out of doors, winding up the day's work as a rule with a walk down to the cool valley, along the beach and back. I soon found that all the housework could be safely left to Miss Carkeek. She did not talk much. Indeed, her only fault, a rare one in housekeepers, was that she talked too little. And even when I addressed her at times, seemed unable to give me attention. It was as though her mind strayed off to some small job she had forgotten, and her eyes wore a listening look, as though she waited for the neglected task to speak and remind her. But, as a matter of fact, she forgot nothing. Indeed, my dears, I was never so well attended to in my life. Well, that is what I'm coming to. That is, so to say, just it. The woman not only had the rooms swept and dusted, and my meals prepared to the moment. In 100 odd little ways, this orderliness, these preparations, seemed to read my desires. Did I wish the roses renewed in a bowl on the dining table? Sure enough, at the next meal, they would be replaced with fresh ones. Miss Carkeek, I told myself, must have surprised and interpreted a glance of mine, yet I could not remember having glanced at the bowl in her presence. And how on earth had she guessed the very roses, the very shapes and colors I had lightly wished for? This was only an instance, you understand. Every day, from morning to night, I happened on others, each slight enough, but altogether bearing witness to a ministering intelligence as subtle as it was untiring. I'm a light sleeper, as you know, with an uncomfortable knack for waking with the sun and roaming early. No matter how early I rose at Tressilac, Miss Carkeek seems to have prevented me. Finally, I had to conclude that she arose and dusted and tidied as soon as she judged me safely abed. For once, finding the drawing room, where I'd been sitting late, readied up at 4 a.m. with no trace of the plate of raspberries I had carried thither after dinner and left overnight. I determined to test her and walked through the kitchen, calling her by name. I found the kitchen as clean as a pin, and the fire laid, but no trace of Miss Carkeek. I waited upstairs and knocked at her door. The second knock, a sleepy voice cried out, and presently the good woman stood before me in her nightgown, looking, I thought, very badly scared. "No," I said, "it's not a burglar. But I found out what I wanted, that you do your morning's work overnight. You mustn't wait for me when I choose to sit up. Now go back to bed like a good soul whilst I run down to the beach." She stood, blinking in the dawn. Her face was still white. "Oh, miss," she gasped, "I made sure you must have seen something." "And so I have," I answered, "but it was neither burglars nor ghosts." "Thank God," I heard her say as she turned back to me into her grey room, which faced the north. And I took this for a carelessly pious expression and ran downstairs, thinking no more of it. A few days later, I began to understand. The plan of the Tressilac house, I must explain, was simplicity itself. To the left of the hall you entered was the dining room. To the right, the drawing room with the boudoir beyond. The foot of the stairs faced the front door, and beside it, passing a glazed inner door, you found 2 others right and left, the left opening onto the kitchen, and a right onto a passage which ran by a store cupboard under the bend of the stairs to a neat pantry with the usual shelves and little linen press, and under the window, which faced north, a porcelain basin and brass tap. On the first morning of my tenancy, I had visited this pantry and turned the tap, but no water ran. I suppose this to be accidental. Miss Carkeek had to wash up glassware and crockery, and no doubt Miss Carkeek would complain of any failure in the water supply. But the day after my surprise visit, as I called it, I had picked a basket full of roses and carried them to the pantry as a place to arrange them. I chose a china bowl and went to fill it at the tap. Again, the water would not run. I called Mrs. Carkeek. "What's wrong with this tap? The rest of the house is well enough supplied." "I don't know, miss. I never use it." "Well, there must be a reason. You must find it a great nuisance washing up the plate and glasses in the kitchen. Come around the back with me and we'll have a look at the cisterns." "The cisterns are all right, miss. I assure you, I don't find it to be trouble." But I will not be put off. The back of the house stood but 10 feet, which was really but a stone fence built into the cliff, away from the cliff cut away by the architect. Above the cliff rose the kitchen garden, and from its lower path we looked over the wall's parapet upon the cisterns. There were two, a very large one, supplying the kitchen and bathroom above the kitchen, and a small one, obviously fed by the other, and obviously leading by a pipe which I could trace to the pantry. Now the big cistern stood almost full, yet the small one, though on a lower level, was empty. "It's as plain as daylight," I said. "The pipe between the two is choked," and I clambered onto the parapet. "I wouldn't, miss. The pantry tap is only cold water and no use to me. From the kitchen boiler I gets it hot, you see. But I want the pantry water for my flowers." I bent over and groped. "I thought as much," said I, as I wrenched out a thick plug of cork, and immediately the water began to flow. I turned triumphantly to Miss Carkeek, who had suddenly grown red in the face. Her eyes were fixed on the cork in my hand. To keep it more firmly wedged in its place, somebody had wrapped it round with a rag of calico print, and, discolored though the rag was, I seemed to recall the pattern, a lilac spring. Then our eyes met, and it occurred to me that only 2 mornings before, Miss Carkeek had worn a print gown with the same sprigged pattern. I had the presence of mind to hide this very small discovery, sliding over it with some trivial remark, and presently Miss Carkeek regained her composure. But I own I felt disappointed in her. It seemed such a paltry thing to be disingenuous over. She had deliberately acted a fib before me. And why? Merely because she preferred the kitchen to the pantry tap? It was childish. But servants are all the same, I told myself. I must take Miss Carkeek as she is, and after all, she is a treasure. To add my admonishment, no rain was falling. No rain had fallen. I felt the slate. I skipped ahead. I'm sorry. That was wrong. There we go. Sorry. On the second night after this, and between 11 and 12 o'clock, I was lying in bed and read myself sleepy over a novel of Lord Lytton's when a small sound disturbed me. I listened. The sound was clearly that of water trickling, and I set it down to rain. A shower, I told myself, had filled the water pipes which drained the roof. Somehow, I could not fix the sound. There was a water pipe just against the wall outside my window. I rose up and drew the blind. To my admonishment, no rain was falling. No rain had fallen. I felt the slate window spill. Some dew had gathered there. No more. There was no wind, no cloud, only a still moon high over the eastern slope of the Coombe, and a distant splash of the waves and a fragrance of many roses. I went back to bed and listened again. Yes, the trickling sound continued, quite distinct in the silence of the house, not to be confused for the moment of the dull murmur of the beach. After a while, it began to grate on my nerves. I caught up my candle, flung my dressing gown about me, and stole softly down the stairs. Then it was simple. I traced the sound to the pantry. "Miss Carkeek has left the tap running," said I, and sure enough, I found it so. A thin trickle steadily running to waste in the porcelain basin. I turned off the tap and went contentedly back to bed and slept. For some hours. I opened my eyes in darkness, and at once I knew what had awakened me. The tap was running again. Now, it had shut easily in my hand, but not so easily that I could believe it had slipped open again of its own accord. "This is Miss Carkeek's doing," I said. And I'm afraid I added, "Bother Miss Carkeek." Well, there was no help for it. So I struck a light, looked at my watch, and saw that the hour was just 3 o'clock, and ascended the stairs again. At the pantry door, I paused. I was not afraid. Not one bit. In fact, the notion that anything might be wrong never crossed my mind. But I remember thinking, with my hand on the door, that if Miss Carkeek were in the pantry, I might happen to give her a severe fright. I pushed the door open briskly. Miss Carkeek was not there. But something was there, by the porcelain basin. Something which might have sent me scurrying upstairs 2 steps at a time, but which, as a matter of fact, held me to my spot. My heart seemed to stand still, so still. And in the stillness, I remember setting down the brass candlestick on a tall nest of drawers beside me. Over the porcelain basin, beneath the water trickling from the tap, I saw 2 hands. That was all. 2 small hands. A child's hands. I cannot tell you how they ended. No, they were not cut off. I saw them quite distinctly. Just a pair of small hands and wrists, and after that, nothing. They were moving briskly, washing themselves clean. I saw the water trickle and splash over them, not through them, but just as it would on real hands. They were the hands of a little girl, too. Oh, yes, I was sure of that at once. Boys and girls wash their hands differently. I can't tell you what the difference is, but it's unmistakable. I saw all of this before my candle slipped and fell with a crash. I had set it down without looking, for my eyes were fixed on the basin, and it had balanced on the edge of the nest of drawers. After the crash, in the darkness there, with the water running, I suffered some bad moments. Oddly enough, the thought uppermost to me was that I must shut off that tap before escaping. I had to. And after a while, I picked up my courage, so to say, between my teeth, and with a little sob, thrust out my hand and did it. And then I fled. The dawn was close upon me, and as soon as the sky reddened, I took my bath, dressed, went downstairs, and there at the pantry door, I found Miss Carkeek, also dressed, with my candlestick in her hand. "Ah," said I, "you picked it up." Our eyes met. Clearly, Miss Carkeek wished for me to begin, and I determined at once to have it out with her. "So you knew all about it? That's what accounts for you plugging up the cistern." "You saw," she began. Yes, you must tell me all about it. Never mind how bad. Is it murder?" "Law bless you, miss. Whatever put such horrors in your head?" "She was washing her hands." "Ah, so she does, poor dear, but murder? But dear Miss Margaret wouldn't hurt a fly." "Miss Margaret?" "Yes, she died at year 7. Squire Kendall's only daughter, and that was over 20 years ago. I was a nurse, miss, diphtheria it was. She took it down in the village." "But how do you know that it's Margaret?" "Those hands, why, how could I mistake? That used to be her nurse." "But why does she wash them?" "Well, miss, being always a dainty child and the housework, you see." I took a long breath. "Do you mean to tell me that all this tidying and dusting—" I broke off. "Is it she who has been taking care of me?" Miss Carkeek met my look steadily. "Who else, miss?" "Poor little soul." "Well now," Miss Carkeek rubbed my candlestick with the edge of her apron. "I'm so glad you take it like this, for there really is nothing to be afraid of, is there?" She eyed me wistfully. "It's my belief she loves you, miss, but only to think of what of time she must have had with the others." "The others?" I echoed. "The other tenants, miss. The ones before you." "Were they bad?" "It was awful. Didn't Farmer Hosking tell you? They carried on fearful one after the other, and each one worse than the last." "What was the matter with them? Drink?" "Drink, miss, with some of them. There was the major, he used to go mad with it, and run about the coombe in his nightshirt. Oh, scandalous. His wife drank too. That is, if she ever was his wife. Just think of that tender child washing up after those nasty doings. I shivered. But that wasn't the worst, miss, not by a long way. They were a pair from here, from the colonies, or so they gave out, with 2 children, a boy and a gal, the eldest scarce 6, poor mites. Why, what happened? They beat those children, miss. Your blood would boil, and starved and tortured them, it's my belief. You could hear their screams, I've been told, away at the high road. And that's the best part of a half mile. Sometimes they was locked up without food for days together. It was my belief that Miss Margaret managed to feed them somehow. Oh, I can see her creeping up to the door and comforting. But perhaps she never showed herself to those awful people here, but took to flight after they left. You didn't never know her, miss. Brave she was. She'd have stood up to lions. She'd have been here all the while. And only to think of what her innocent eyes and ears must have took in. There was another couple. Miss Carkeek sunk her voice. Oh, hush! If I'm to have any peace of mind in this house. But she won't go, miss. She loves you, I know she do. And I think what you might be leaving her to, what sort of tenant might come next. For she can't go. She'd been here ever since her father sold the place. He died soon after. You mustn't go. Now I had resolved to go, but all of a sudden, I felt how mean that resolution was. After all, I said, there's nothing to be afraid of. That's it, miss, nothing at all. I don't believe it's very uncommon. Why, I've heard my mother tell of farmhouses where rooms were swept every night as regular as clockwork, the floors sanded, and the pots and pans scoured all while the maids slept. They put it down to the pixies, and they know better, miss. And now that we've got this secret between us, we can lie easy in our beds, and if we hear anything, say, God bless the child, and go to sleep. Miss Carkeek, I said, there's only one condition I have to make. What's that? Why, that you let me kiss you. Oh, you dear, said Miss Carkeek, as we embraced. This was as close to familiarity as she allowed herself to go in the whole course of my acquaintance with her. I spent 3 years at Tresslack, and all the while Miss Carkeek lived with me and shared the secret. Few women, I dare say, were ever so completely wrapped around with love as we were during those 3 years. It ran through my waking life like a song. It smoothed my pillow and touched and made my table comfy. In summer, it lifted the heads of flowers as I passed, and in winter, it watched the fire with me and kept it bright. Why did I ever leave Tresslack? Because one day, at the end of 5 years, Farmer Hosking brought me word that he had sold the house, or was about to sell it. I forget which. There was no avoiding it, at any rate, the purchaser being a Colonel Kendall, the brother of the old squire. A married man? I asked. Yes, miss, with a family of 8, as pretty children as you ever see, and a mother a good lady. It's old home to Colonel Kendall. I see, that's why you feel so bound to sell. It's a good price, too, that he offers. You mustn't think, but I'm sorry enough. To turn me out? I thank you, Mr. Hosking. You're doing the right thing. Since Miss Carkeek was to stay, the arrangement lacked nothing of absolute perfection, except perhaps that it found no room for me. She, Margaret, will be happy, I said, with her cousins, you know. Oh yes, miss, she will be happy sure enough, Miss Carkeek agreed. So, when the time came, I packed up my boxes and tried to be cheerful. But on the last morning, when they stood corded in the hall, I sent Miss Carkeek upstairs with some poor excuse and stepped alone into the pantry. Margaret, I whispered. There was no answer at all. I had scarcely dared to hope for one. Yet, I tried again, shutting my eyes this time, and stretched out both hands as I whispered, Margaret! And I will swear to my dying day that 2 little hands stole and rested for only a moment. Thank you for coming to Storytime today. I really appreciate it. Have a wonderful time.